You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, in light of the DOJ's new superseding indictment against Donald Trump, one of his January 6 architects, Jeffrey Clark, has made a pretty stunning revelation himself here. What just happened?
So, there were disciplinary proceedings conducted against Jeffrey Clark by the D.C. Bar Council to see if Jeffrey Clark should lose his law license for being part of, Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy to try to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And Brian, just a matter of days ago, the disciplinary panel of the D.C. Bar issued a 213-page report concluding, after an extensive hearing, Jeffrey Clark should have his law license suspended. But then we got the superseding indictment where Jack Smith, because he was concerned with Donald Trump's potential presidential immunity, nobody else's immunity, he pulled out of the indictment the language about Donald Trump directing Jeffrey Clark to basically, do some dirt on his Donald Trump's behalf. So Jeffrey Clark may have been absent from class the day this case was argued in court, and maybe he doesn't realize that presidential immunity isn't Jeffrey Clark immunity, but it really only applies to presidents. So here is what Jeffrey Clark wrote in like a little 1.5-page letter to the court that oversees this disciplinary panel of the D.C. Bar. He said that because the superseding indictment deleted that information about Donald Trump, talking to me about doing his dirty bidding, quote, Mr. Clark is not just unindicted, but unindictable. Well, the problem with that, Brian, is in the many oral arguments that have been conducted on presidential immunity, the arguments to Judge Chutkan, the arguments to the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and even the Supreme Court arguments, one of the driving concerns that we heard over and over again is that if a president of the United States has presidential immunity, he could order, for example, SEAL Team 6 to take out his political rival. The problem with that is SEAL Team 6 would still be on the hook for the crimes they committed. Why? They ain't president. Jeffrey Clark is the functional equivalent of SEAL Team 6 in that scenario. But like I say, maybe he was absent from class that day. This superseding indictment that took out some of Donald Trump's conduct has no impact on whether Jeffrey Clark is indicted or indictable. Now, what he was referring to there is he was an unindicted co-conspirator in the first Trump indictment, but he's not once they took that information out of the superseding indictment. Doesn't mean he's not indictable for the crimes he may have committed as part of this, criminal operation. It's just that for the moment, he no longer appears as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Trump indictment in D.C. Of course, let's remember, he's an indicted RICO defendant in Georgia. So this is Jeffrey Clark, doodling off his little 1.5-page letter, trying to flex and assert that he's no longer in trouble when nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, the thing is, too, if they ultimately do decide to indict him in D.C., then they'll include that information in his indictment. The only reason they took it away from Donald Trump's indictment is because he would be the one to enjoy presidential immunity. But Jeffrey Clark doesn't, because he's not the president. And so if they wanted to indict him, they would just include that information in an indictment against him.
Exactly. And he can still be indicted, assuming Jack Smith continues to present evidence to the grand jury about what Jeffrey Clark did and what John Eastman did and what Sidney Powell did and what Rudy Giuliani did and what Kenneth Chesbro did and the other presently unindicted co-conspirators in the federal courts, as I say, not down in Georgia where Jeffrey Clark and the others are indicted. So yes, he can still be indicted. He will still be indicted if the evidence supports indicting him. And really the key takeaway for our viewers is presidential immunity doesn't equal Jeffrey Clark immunity.
Now, can you speak about whether you think there's a high likelihood that we'll see some type of superseding indictment in the D.C. case that includes all of these unindicted co-conspirators?
Brian, you know my betting limit, as do our viewers. $1. I am not a high roller. I'm not a gambling man. I would put the whole buck on Jack Smith next indicting the formerly unindicted co-conspirators. And here's why, including Jeffrey Clark, assuming he has enough evidence to secure an indictment from the grand jury. I think the unindicted co-conspirators in the Trump indictment, before the superseding indictment was returned, Jeffrey Clark, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Kenneth Chesebro, and I think Boris Epstein was likely the sixth. That's an open question. Here is what Jack Smith would never do, in my estimation, as a former career federal prosecutor. There's no way he would announce to the world in that first Trump indictment, folks, these 6 unindicted co-conspirators helped Donald Trump try to override the expressed will of the American voters, try to reverse a presidential election, and try to, in a very real sense, end our democracy. But you know what, folks? I'm going to give those 6 people a pass.
Right.
Not going to happen. I think the timing of the next indictment was largely dependent on whether Jack Smith thought he could get Donald Trump to trial in the federal case in D.C. before the election. It looks like that will not now happen. But yes, you are going to see, bet on it, some additional federal indictments handed down in the probably not too distant future.
And do you think that those indictments will be part of this case, or will that be a separate case? Will they want to keep Donald Trump alone?
That's a great question. So if they try to run all of the co-conspirators separately and run Donald Trump in a trial just, unto himself, believe it or not, what those defendants could do was file a motion to join. They could actually, and it's not often done, but it is a lawful process. You can file a motion to join. And if there are similar defendants who are charged with similar crimes as part of the same criminal scheme, then they can bring those cases together or try to have a judge rule that they should be joined together for trial. So if all of those defendants think it's in their tactical interest to be tried together, and they may, then they'll do that. But I also think there is some wisdom to just trying Donald Trump himself, regardless of when this trial actually commences. It could be a year from now after Donald Trump loses the presidential election, because if he wins, he will tell his attorney general to dismiss all federal cases against him and probably his criminal associates as well. But I think, Jack Smith might be well advised to try to just keep Donald Trump as a standalone trial, so you don't have, for example, 6 or 7 or 8 criminal defense attorneys, each representing one of the co-defendants, cross-examining every flipping witness. I've been in that circumstance. I tried a 6 co-defendant RICO trial with 11 defense attorneys. It went on for 6 months. Yeah. I don't recommend it to anybody. So I think Jack Smith would be well advised to try to keep Donald Trump as a standalone trial.
Okay, and then finally the issue at hand here. What do you think the likelihood of Jeffrey Clark hanging on to his law license is going to be?
So the recommendation of the 3-person panel of the D.C. bar was that his law license should be suspended for 2 years. I have a feeling that is where this will end up. He will have his law license suspended. I don't think Jack Smith's decision regarding the superseding indictment will have much of an impact at all. So, yeah, I think Jeffrey Clark remains not only an indicted co-conspirator in the Georgia State RICO case, but I think he remains imminently indictable federally and at risk for losing his bar license.
Does it not seem crazy to you that 2 years is the length of time that they're willing to go to for somebody who sought to undermine an American election, but by using his legal license to do it?
Yeah, justice delayed in any number of settings is justice denied. And the longer you take to bring folks to justice or hold them accountable for trying to run roughshod over the expressed will of the American people, the more you're encouraging and emboldening others who would choose that same criminal path. So that is a real problem. And what we've been talking about all along is when this sad chapter in American history is in our rearview mirror, we really do need to take a hard look at the institutions of government, particularly those that are responsible for enforcing the law, and they need to be in the business of enforcing the law in a timely manner, because if not, if you let it linger, you end up where we are 4 years after the last insurrection, with Donald Trump, the perpetrator of the last insurrection, trying to do it all over again. That is no place for a civilized nation to be.
Well, it's not just the fact that it's been so delayed in terms of seeking some semblance of accountability here, but being able to use your law license to undermine an election seems like enough of a predicate to just revoke somebody's law license altogether, not just to suspend it for 2 years.
Yeah, Rudy Giuliani certainly learned that the hard way, didn't he? And yet Jeffrey Clark's case has lingered. And what I will say, Brian, having toiled away inside the criminal justice system for 3 decades, things don't often happen quickly. And I'm glad that we give everybody due process and then some to challenge any allegations, whether they're coming from a criminal court or they're coming from a bar disciplinary panel. I mean, we want people to have a healthy dose of due process to be able to defend themselves. But for gosh sakes, we do very little of it in a timely manner.
Yeah. Well, we will, of course, stay on top of what happens with Jeffrey Clark and these kind of ridiculous attempts at absolving himself that he's putting forward right now. For those watching, if you want to stay on top of this stuff, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.